And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us. And one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it. And that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tales. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight we're going to be joined by my guest, Allison. Allison is a lifelong experiencer when it comes to which she believes to be extraterrestrials. Started from a very early age with a UFO sighting with her family, and it's progressed ever since then. Before we bring Allison on, if you'd like to be a guest on Tinfoil Tales, there's a couple things you can do. You can send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to tinfoiltales.com and go to the contact section, whichever way works for me. So just make sure to send a message and we'll get something scheduled for a future episode. If you would like to help the podcast out, please continue to share it around. Word of mouth is the best way of getting the podcast out to new listeners. For every new listener, it could be a new guest, so new episodes coming your way. You can also help out by leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts at. It does help out with the rankings. Just make sure to do that. Just know it's definitely appreciated. Make sure to check out the Patreon. Follow me on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, X. We're going to go ahead now and bring Allison on. Looking forward to talking with her. Hope you guys enjoy the conversation. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take this time to welcome my guest tonight, Allison. Thanks for coming on here and talking with me.
Thank you for inviting me, Brandon. I appreciate this opportunity.
Not a problem. Would you like to let the audience know a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Allison. I am Indigenous First Nations from the Big Stone Cree Nation, which is in northern Alberta. I grew up in Slave Lake, which is about an hour and a half from Wabasca, and I currently live in Edmonton, Alberta. So I've been here for the majority of my adult life. Yeah, and I have 3 sons. I was a very avid researcher back in the early 2000s. At one time, I was probably the only Alberta researcher at the time that I was aware of that offered support for those who were dealing with the effects of the post-traumatic experiences of their abductions. So I offered like a calling service, and a lot of people called me when they were at their highest peak of anxiety. So yeah, it was interesting that I did that work, and I would have liked to have continued that on, but it doesn't pay the bills.
No, I can't imagine. Do you want to let the audience know a little bit you mentioned you had like previous experience, like childhood experience or anything? You want to kind of dive into that and we just see where it goes?
Sure. So I'll start off with like my family dynamic of it. So my grandmother had numerous experiences, and some of my aunts and uncles, numerous cousins, and then our children. My children, not specifically, but my cousins' children have been experiences still going through that. So I think during the time when my grandmother was having these experiences, she didn't really talk about it too much to a lot of people, but those of us who were aware of how these experiences follow the bloodline, this is one of those cases. I don't know what really happened before my grandmother's time, if it continued before or when this happened. But I often wondered if the residential schools in that era affected this, or they took a pause, or if it continued. I don't really know much what happened before my grandmother, but she has quite a few stories. She never really did continue to uh, tell her story. I was hoping she would have wrote a book about her experiences, but I guess that'll leave it to me to tell her stories for her. Um, but when what happened to my family this was in Wabasca, Alberta, and I was October 7th, 1979. We had some relatives coming in from out of town that were visiting, and I have two brothers, so I was 7 years old. My brother Darren was 5, and my baby brother Stevie, we call him Stevie, he was 7 months old. And we had a relative, a cousin of mine, who was babysitting us while my mother and aunt went to Slave Lake, which is where a lot of people did their shopping. Uh, so that particular evening, it was dusk, like it was not that dark out. My mom and aunt had just left, and I remember sitting on the sofa, which my back was facing the lake. So really, this was a small native community. There was no street lights. There was maybe some property lights. It was a gravel road, one way in, one way out of this community. So um, at the time, it was very I guess desolate in a way, I guess. So when I was sitting on the sofa and I saw the lights that were shining, hitting the trailer walls. And I thought, well, where is that light coming from? So I remember looking out the window and I didn't see the lights coming down directly, but because the UFO was already right above the property coming down, I would say it was treetop level when I was looking up at it. And while it was coming down, there was an intense humming noise. The trailer was shaking violently. Pictures were falling off the walls. Things were falling off the counters and tables. Um, we all started screaming. The humming noise was hurting our ears, so we're all plugging our ears. I don't know if it was from the how loud it was or if it was the vibration that was hurting. But I remember just all of us running and screaming. And 1 minute we're hiding under the kitchen table, and then the next, my 5-year-old brother was gone, and we were yelling for him, trying to find him. We couldn't find him. It was a small trailer we're in, and he was not there. The next memory I have is now looking out the window, and it was much darker, and the UFO was no longer above us, but it was across, it was right across, this was lakefront property, and the UFO was hovering above the lake, and you can see the outward light shining. That was like a belt of color, I used to call it, a belt of color that circled the craft, and it was shining outward. But there was also a white beam of light that was coming from the middle of the craft into the water. And you could see the stream of water going into the craft. I wasn't sure at that time if it was putting something in the water or taking water. But as soon as that was done, it was done with the white light. It shot right up to the sky, and it was gone within like a split second. It was gone. Um, Moments later, my mom walked in, and we were all crying and screaming and saying, "Mom, Mom, did you see the UFO?" Because in my mind, only minutes had passed. Um, so where my grandmother's property is and to where the main road is, it's about probably a 10-minute drive to get from the home to the main road to Slave Lake, when you can actually see across the lake my grandmother's property. So in my mind, I thought she had driven that distance, saw the UFO, and turned back. And in fact, she was gone for about 4 hours. So I remember I said, "Mommy, Mommy, did you see the UFO? Did you turn back?" And she came in with groceries. So I knew that she had been gone. And I couldn't understand it in my brain. I was trying to fathom, like, how did time speed up? Like that was the only way I could think of it at 7 years old. How did time speed up? How come it's now, this time of the night when it was just 5 o'clock earlier? So there was a lot of time that was gone. So when my mom walked in the door, she was very upset to see the mess that was happening, that was around the home. As I mentioned, like things falling off the walls and the counters. And my mom was like yelling at my cousin saying, "What happened here? What's going on?" And we're all trying to tell her, but she wasn't listening to us. And so she picked up the baby who was struggling to breathe. And we're trying to explain to her like what happened. Um, but maybe she couldn't understand because I tend to talk fast sometimes when I'm excited. So she probably had a hard time understanding me. Um, so when she had my brother on her shoulder and she was patting his back and she turned, and when I looked at him, his eyes were rolled up, his mouth was wide open, purple lips, and his arms went straight out and his legs went stiff, and he started having a convulsion right in her arms, and she started screaming as well, and we all started screaming again. She told my cousin she was actually sitting in the corner of the home, in the fetal position, like she was not responding to my mom as she was calling her out, calling her name. So eventually, when all of us started screaming again, she snapped out of that trance or whatever she was in, and my mom told her, "Go get Clara." That's my grandmother. But just as she was leaving, my grandmother was coming over to the home and asked like if we're all okay, and obviously we weren't. And my mom handed my baby brother, who was now not breathing, into her arms, and she didn't know what to do. She's never seen a baby like this, stiff arms out and stiff legs out. And then of course the whites of his eyes were showing, and um, it was pretty traumatic, that part as well, to see my brother go through that. Meanwhile, she's yelling at us to go to the next door. So we were all going next door, but literally my mother had to drag me and my 5-year-old brother, drag us because we did not want to go outside. We were so terrified of what was out there. I remember like trying to fight her to like pull back and not go in. But when we all went into the home, they laid my brother on the kitchen table, and she sent us kids to the living room where my other cousins were. And we're all huddled in, like just all holding on to each other because they had witnessed the UFO as well. But they didn't know that we experienced something more than just them witnessing the UFO. We actually experienced that. So we were sitting in the living room with them, and my auntie was yelling, "I can't get oxygen to him. He's not, there's a blockage." And so she looked in his mouth, and there was some white foam, thick foam at the back of his throat. And it wasn't like the typical saliva type of foam you'd get when you're having a seizure or anything like that. It was something different. And she couldn't really explain the consistency of it, but it was nothing that she had seen before. And she managed to scoop that out of his mouth and his throat, and then was able to get a passageway to get oxygen to his lungs from there. So he was not breathing for, we're guessing, about maybe 8 minutes. Um, and when everybody's panicking and we're all scared, and we didn't know if he was going to live or die. And eventually my grandmother or my auntie brought him back. She revived him. And when he started crying, we all were in relief of like, oh, he's back. Um, and then so my mom and aunt took him into the truck and they drove back to Slave Lake, which was 135 kilometers of dirt road at the time. So there was no hospital in Wabasca. There was a nurse's station, but they were closed at that time. So they drove him to Slave Lake. Meanwhile, I'm at the house, the big house with with grandma and cousins, and none of us slept that night because we had a big window in the bedroom, and I remember like there's no curtains, and we were all scared to look up in the sky. Um, so the next day, we were feeling brave, the cousins and I, and we started to walk around looking for any type of residue of what happened the night before. It was fresh snow, a fresh blanket of snow, and we didn't see any tracks. We didn't see anything that would have made us think that they were walking around on the property. Um, so after we were doing that, I can see my dad and grandpa. They were on a boat coming back from hunting, so they were coming back to the lake shore. And I stood at the top of the cliff and I'm waiting for my dad to come back. And because they were just across the lake, I thought they would have seen the UFO. And I said, "Daddy, Daddy, did you see the UFO? Did you see it? It was above the property, above." We called my grandmother a different name. We called her Jim Jim. So it's above Jim Jim's house. And um, he didn't know what I was talking about because I'm talking fast. I'm talking, and I said, "Daddy, Daddy, there was a UFO." The house was shaking, and I was trying to explain to him what was going on. But a 7-year-old trying to tell an adult, right? It was probably difficult for him to comprehend what I was trying to say until I said, "Stevie almost died. He's at the hospital." And then he dropped everything, ran to the house, to my grandmother's house, and but I chased behind him. I said, "But Daddy, Daddy, there was a UFO." Um, so he was released from the hospital, and there was no determination of what it was. They just tried to make it up and say, "Oh, he might have had a reaction to maybe aspirin." Well, firstly, he wasn't given aspirin, and he wasn't given anything that would have caused that reaction. We're waiting for the hospital records for that event because my brother has to be the one to request them. So um, he's alive and well, um, and he doesn't have any memory of this. Of course, he was only 7 months old, but and neither does my cousin. She was 13. She has no memory of the UFO encounter, but she remembers what happened afterwards when we're all panicking about my brother's condition. And my 5-year-old brother and I, we have what I call chopped memory. And those kind of what he remembers, I remember. With like the shaking, the him being gone. So there's a lot of things that we have shared memory of, but we don't have recollection of what happened in those hours that we were gone.
Do you think that they don't remember because they weren't actually involved with, like, not saying like you guys were like taken or anything, but maybe they just weren't involved with it, so their mind just doesn't accept it because you guys were the ones that actually were involved in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. The baby was only 7 months old, so he wouldn't have remembered anything at that age anyway. My cousin, who was, like I was mentioning, she was almost like she was in a trance and not responsive when we were calling her name out. Um, for her not to remember the UFO, because she would have not remembered running around, running from the trailer, looking for my brother, screaming, running back and forth as we're all panicking because it was like an earthquake. I would have thought she would have remembered that at least. But um, I'll kind of share what happened. So I met a lot of people through my life, and I call them messengers because it's just out of the blue if someone shows up in my life, or I'm at a stoplight, crossing the street to walk, and someone wants to stop and talk to me. And this woman said to me, she said, "Dear one, do you realize you have a UFO attached to you?" And I looked up and I went, "Oh no, they found me." And she said, "No, no, I mean in your life." And I said, "Yes, absolutely, I do." And she said, what I'm seeing, and she said this to me, she said, "What I'm seeing is that there were four of you, and two of you remember, you're close in age, and there was a baby and a teenager who have no memory." And I said, "Yeah, you're talking about a UFO experience that I had when I was a child." And she said, "Well, the reason why you and your brother can remember is because the memory serum that they gave you wasn't enough. The reason why the older one doesn't remember because they gave her too much. And the reason why the baby almost died was because they gave him too much. Whoever it was that took you, they were experimenting, and they didn't even know how much of that serum to give." And I'm like, "Well, that makes a lot of sense." Um, so it's hard to put that into um like to believe what she said, but it for her to just come up and say that without even knowing me, and she totally was able to see what had happened. Um, and then her explanation of why we remember some things, but the teenager didn't.
I'm trying to think, like, I don't know what it would be considered, but when you say like the UFO attachment or something, like, do you think that they without going too far into it, do you remember anything like later on, like the similar thing, like with beans or anything like that? Like, were they the same ones, like later
Absolutely.
on? Okay.
I have memory of a conscious memory. I've never done any regression. Um, But my conscious memories, I've encountered several different types of beings. And I was actually told um, that I needed to learn about energy uh, because I needed to hone in my energy because you're like a beacon out there in the universe and you're attracting so many different types of anomalies and you need to bring that energy in. And that made so much sense to me as well because she had knew nothing about my experiences. So the ex that night of the UFO experience where the community, so this is the other thing too, the community of Wabasca was maybe 2,000 people at the time. And people witnessed the UFO, and it was actually in the local Slave Lake paper. And I've actually just been trying to find the articles to it. But the Lakeside Leader and the Scope, that's what they're called, they wrote a story about this UFO witnessing. People who witnessed the UFO. And so it appeared twice. Someone said it appeared around dinner time and it came back in the evening, about 10 o'clock. So I really don't know exact timelines, but everybody who I spoke to and interviewed in Wabasca talked about the UFO appearing twice above my grandmother's property, and RCMP were called. And as the RCMP went to my grandmother's home, a trail of vehicles of the community were following to come and see the UFO. So that alerted the newspaper guy in Slave Lake to do a story on it. So Slave Lake had a big fire in 2011, and unfortunately, all of his archives were burnt. What I'm waiting for right now is the Slave Lake Library's archives to get back to me to see if I could actually find the article on that event and what they wrote about it. So I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see what they had about it. What year did you say that was?
1979.
Okay.
And the RCMP were called. So I even contacted like RCMP archives and nobody knew who to patch me to. Like, we have no idea who to send you to.
What would you say the shape of it actually was?
It
If you
was
could,
saucer, yeah, it was saucer shaped, um, and metallic. Uh, the belt of color, as I mentioned, that circled the middle, um, the middle of the craft. There were like little square um, lights that were shining outwardly, and it circled the craft. The craft would be in one spot, and the lights were circling the craft. And if I was to estimate the size, so my grandmother's property is probably about 10 or 12 acres. From my grandmother's home to where we were, it was probably about, I would say almost 3 acres. And so when I looked up to look out, I couldn't even see the sky. All I could see was the undercarriage, under of the craft, the underside of the craft.
well, it was really big, basically.
Yes, and for
Very
it to
large.
yes, and for it to affect like the humming was hurting our ears, like it was so intense. And for it was a trailer, so it was a like a two-bedroom trailer. So um it's metal. So I'm guessing that, the magnetic field of the craft was probably affecting the home, which is
Hmm.
why it was like an earthquake in there.
A lot of the vibrations just from the thing, whatever energy it was putting off, could be, like you said, the magnetic vibe, or even the just the vibrations in general from something
Yes.
hovering. So no, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's in 2001, I was actually going to be doing a reenactment, a documentary, um, I guess what they were going to call it was a documentary drama because we're going to be doing reenactments of the event. I had it all planned out in 2001. Space Channel wanted that was called Space Channel then. I don't know if it still is now, but Space Channel wanted it because it would have been the first Indigenous story to come out of a UFO story. Um, APTN, which is a Canadian Indigenous station that probably has been around for maybe 40 years now, they wanted rights to the story as well because the same thing would have been the first paranormal UFO story that they'd be broadcasting. And so at during this time, I was working on the final stages of the project, So during that time, I interviewed about 12 people, and I got the same story from 12 people of what they saw that same night. Um, and I was actually going to do the filming right in the community. I had all the resources to get this project done. I worked with the actors at that time. And so having those things at my fingertips made this project would have been very successful. However, uh, I someone or something did not want me to tell the story. And if ever in my life of going through all these life experiences, if I ever felt threatened or afraid, this was the time. Because now my family was being affected. And they told my child that they would take him if I didn't stop what I was doing. My child didn't know what I was doing. He was 3.5 years old, but we had shared experiences. And he told me, Mommy, if you don't stop what you're doing, they're going to take me. And so um, that was a really tough time for me. And so I stopped the project. I stopped everything and never did tell the story.
Yeah, when it comes to shows and stuff like that, I don't know how all that works, but I feel like a lot of times, at least with recent stuff, I feel like a lot of things when they get a hold of it, they try to, I don't want to say embellish, but make it more entertaining. So I'm always a little hesitant when it comes to TV shows or anything when it comes to putting out stories or whatever. But I can see where if something happened and they didn't want the story to get out there, I can see where it could manifest itself into making it to where it doesn't come out there too. So
Yeah, I went at that time we had dial-up in 2001. And while I was on the final stages, I was actually back then we had MSN Messenger, remember that? And I was chatting with somebody from MUFON in Vancouver, and I was needing more resources for this project. I wasn't going to let anybody Hollywood it, I was not going to let it to be, I wanted it true, factual, and the way I was going to do it. And the people that were around me to film, my producer, we all were on the same page. We're not going to make this a Hollywood film. This is a true story. We want this to be shared. So we weren't going to be doing any embellishment of anything. However, so while I was working on the project, I was getting this MSN Messenger file transfer. He was sending me a list of critics because that's one thing they said, we need a critic. I said, okay, I'll find a critic. And so I got a hold of MUFON and they did this MSN transfer. Shortly after that, my screen went red, black, red, black. My phone rang, and on the phone display, it said 0123456789. And when I answered it, it was just static. And so my screen's shutting down, the phone's ringing, and I didn't know what was going on. When I turned the computer back on, it was like a half an hour. It was not doing anything. Everything that had was that when it finally did come on, everything that I had on my desktop, whether it was a file or a file folder or an application, everything was just an empty file folder on my screen. They totally wiped out everything. And also I had those 8.5 floppy disks in my computer. They even wiped that out.
Hmm.
And my cousin was a computer tech guy at the time. He said, we don't even have the technology to do that. Sure, you know, we could come and wipe out your computer, but to have a disk in that drive and wipe it out, we don't have that technology yet. After that experience with my computer shutting down, everything, my cousin got everything back up for me, which was great. But after that, I had a strange black car parked outside my house. And this happened for 5 days in a row. This black car with two men in there, black hats, black suits, and just staring at my house the whole time. On top of that, so I'm looking at your background pictures and I'm trying to see if I could find a resemblance of what came to us. So the first day that the computer did its thing, my son and I had a shared dream, and there were panthers. I would want to call them maybe shapeshifters because these panthers were walking on hind legs, and then they went down to all four, big yellow eyes. And my son, the 3-year-old, was mentioning that's exactly what he saw too. And so we had that dream, like it was dream-like, dream state, twice. And the 5 days of the car parked outside my house, I called the police to come and check. They wouldn't do it. I took pictures. But back then we didn't have like cell phones, right? And picture cell phones. So I had a camera and I took pictures of that car every day from that of that time. And when I went to got the film developed, they were all black. I couldn't believe it. Every picture that I took of that car was black, blacked out. Strange. So
Could you tell what type of a vehicle it was?
it was a four-door sedan. I'm not privy to knowing makes and
Mhm.
models. My son would have known because he's a mechanic now and he knew makes and models when he was 5 years old, but he didn't see the car because he'd be at school during that time. So yeah, I just know it was a four-door sedan. The two guys had the hats on. On the fifth day of that, I got upset and I put my shoes on. I went outside and they drove off. And I'm like, I know who you are. I'm like chasing them down the road. I know who you are. And it stopped because I then spoke to the ceiling and I said, okay, I'm going to stop. And I said, but you need to leave me alone. It ends with me. It ends with my kids are not going to be part of this. And I just cried to the ceiling and like, you got to leave us alone. Um, I don't want my kids to go through what I went through.
Yeah. Now, before we dive into more of it, I was going to ask, with you being like your family's indigenous peoples, I've heard I interviewed someone else recently and I've just some things I've read and other things, but I believe that indigenous peoples are more connected to a lot of these experiences and you don't really hear a whole lot about it, but I know like even the Hopi Indians in Arizona, like they had the Star People thing,
Mhm.
like from their stories and everything, but there seems to be a lot more when it comes to abductions, I think, that are actually attracted to the indigenous peoples. I'm not sure if you're familiar with any of that, but
Oh yes, I've been doing research since 1999,
Mhm.
and I tried to research the connection to Indigenous peoples. And there was actually a documentary that was made here in Canada. I think it was Canada, and it was UFOs and aliens. And it talked about the First Nations connection. I truly feel a connection to the Hopi tribe and their belief of the Star People. Uh, in my neck of the woods here in Cree country, we call it. It's either a secret no one wants to talk about, or it's the same thing where we're trying to explore and find out where was that disconnect because the Hopi really believe that we're star people and that we're put on this earth from them and we're here to protect the earth. And then yet there's other cultures that don't have any knowledge of that. I truly want to know where that disconnect happened for us here in Canada. Um, I also have heard of some elders who are from the same area that I grew up in that have had sweats. Are you familiar with a sweat? It's
Is that the where they get into like the heated area with the rocks and like inside the
right.
tent? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So um I've heard that a lot of elders had been sitting with the Greys in these sweats and that they say that the Greys were here to help us. And however, my experiences with the Greys, I did not feel were positive. So I thought, well, why would, if they're here to help us, why did they hurt me? Why did they traumatize me? Why did they continually take me? I can have to say, well, I'm still here. They obviously didn't like abduct me and take me forever. Um, so I realized that there must be a purpose or a reason why they returned me every time. Now, I don't have full recollection of every experience, but the ones that I have, um, I've been in a couple, I've been in two crafts that I'm aware of. And the one experience, I'm going to just back up a little bit. When I was 8 years old, my my mother moved us away from Wabasca because of the trauma that we had experienced with this experience. And we moved to Slave Lake, and I was 8 years old, and I recall a man coming to me. He's wearing a black suit, black hat, and he had a black bag in his hand. And I thought he was a doctor. And the next thing I remember is waking up on a stretcher-like bed. I couldn't move. I had like a white sheet covering my body. I don't know if I had clothes on underneath it. I don't even know because I could only move my eyes. There was a light source above my head, and all I could see is the light shining on me. And there was transparent curtains. That's why I thought I was in a hospital at first. But there's transparent curtains. I can see another person, another girl, not far from me. From my eyes, I could see her to my left, and she was laying on a stretcher bed as well, with a light source above her head. And so I felt like it was just the two of us, but there was a lot of rooms, I guess you can say, that these transparent currents were dividing us from. And I could hear her crying, and it was echoing, a very deep echo. And that's why I felt like I was underground. I felt like I was in a cave. It was rocky and really and kind of cold down there. Um, and I said, "Where are we?" And that echoed like far. I couldn't believe how far deep that echo was just from saying those few words. And then she said, "They're coming." And just then I saw two figures walking on the opposite side of the curtain, and they went right to her, and she started screaming, and then there was nothing. Then those two beings came to me, and all I saw was the syringe needle that they had in their hand. It was this huge needle, and they injected it into my heart. And I felt the puncture, and then I felt the cool liquid fill my chest. And I couldn't breathe, and I felt like I was falling off the bed now. It was weird. I was seeing a lot of weird things. Like I don't know if they did that intentionally to mess with my mind, but I remember like trying to run. I'm trying to run away. I feel like I've gotten off this table now, and I felt like my body was in molasses, like I couldn't barely move. I'm running through a tunnel. It looks like it was a rocky tunnel, like it was carved out. It wasn't smooth. And then next thing I know, there is something running alongside of me or going alongside with me, and I couldn't make out what it was. It looked like circles, different colors of circles that were running alongside of me. It was strange. And then the next thing I know I'm like floating. I'm now like in the air, and I can see the back of my house. At the back of my house was a hallway down to the living room, and the bedrooms were on the side. So I can actually see the inside of my house in the hallway. And I'm going through the house. And then the next thing I know was like slow motion. And then bang, I got through the house. And now I'm running full speed down to the living room where my parents were. And I was crying, and I was hysterical, letting them know like what happened. I said, this man came, he was wearing and I thought he was a doctor. Of course, I'm 8 years old now trying to ramble, and I was terrified, letting them know what happened. And they said, "You're supposed to be in bed hours ago. Get to bed. You just had a nightmare." And I'm like, okay, it's hours later. What? Um, so it was that was an experience that I felt like um what they injected into my heart, what was that? Was it adrenaline to get my heart going, or was it to stop my heart, or what was it? I never got that answer yet as to what they did to me on the table that day. Um,
Do you remember how old you were about that time?
yes, I was 8 years old.
Okay.
That
I
was
didn't,
1980. Yeah.
'Cause I don't remember if you mentioned it prior, but I was just
Mm,
kind of curious how old you would have been.
yeah, yeah. I was 8. That was uh, the first time I had a memory of beings. Now the beings. they were tall, and they had robes, so I couldn't even see what they were. They're covered, so I couldn't see um who they were. They were taller. They weren't grays. Um, however, years throughout my other years as a child, I had a lot of experiences with grays. Um, and to me, it was invasive. I don't find what they did to me was like, oh, we need you to help us. Or there's no communication like that. And if there was, I didn't hear it because I was always very traumatized, and afraid because I thought every time I close my eyes, it's like I wake up somewhere else. Or if I am on the bed, I find myself on the floor with my clothes changed around sometimes. Uh, one of my memories, I was watching over my brothers, and I was probably about 12, and I had that feeling they were going to come because I always had this feeling back of my neck, and I'd have these heart pains all the time whenever I was going to have an experience. These heart pains were like I couldn't take a deep breath. I'd hear thumping, extra thumping happening. I didn't know what it was, but I always knew they were coming from these feelings that I had. And I was trying to fight the sleep because I became an insomniac when I was 8 years old just because of these experiences. But um, I remember like not being afraid to sleep, and I'm trying to fight it. I'm fighting the sleep. I'm babysitting here. I got to stay awake. But I just felt like I was being led to my bedroom, and I went and laid down on the bed. And next thing I know, these three beings came into my room. They came from the wall and from the outside wall, and one touched my feet, and I couldn't move. And then another one was at my standing next to me at my head, and the third one was standing at my torso area of my bed. And the one by my head was unbuttoning my pajamas. I had those old-fashioned pajamas that go up to your neck, the buttons and really long to the floor.
Hmm.
And so he was unbuttoning that, and he started spreading something around my neck. Now it felt like on my chest, it felt like ice, what I felt. Because and then the liquid went like I was laying on my back, so the liquid ran down my neck. And when I woke up from that, like I was awake, I used to call them wake dreams because I could never explain that I would be awake. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up again. So this was a wake dream, is what I would call it. And when I woke up, my neck was still all wet and my buttons were all still undone. And yeah, that was an interesting one where when they held my feet, why I couldn't move, which was strange.
You mentioned the clothes being put on like differently. I've heard
Yeah.
several different instances where that's happened with people, and it just kind of got me thinking it would make sense that they wouldn't understand clothing in the sense because if you ever see the Greys or whatever, they don't wear clothing. Like all the general descriptions that anyone's ever had, they're not usually in any type of thing. But a lot of people believe that these things aren't even actually real in the sense of being like a sentient being, like they're almost like a drone to an extent. Like they're just kind of, I don't want to call it.
Robotic.
Yes.
So,
And what I was going to say is like with modern times to relate this, like when, if you think of machines, even like I use AI to make artwork and some other things, and it makes things very decent, but then there's always a little bit of odd things. Like back when it first started, you might get people that have like 6 or 7 fingers, or the clothing would look a little bit off. So if these things are not actually like fully functional brain capacity, like you and I would be, I could
mhm.
see where things would be off a little bit by them because they're trying to replicate to be like back to normal, but things are just slightly off. And that's kind of how I feel like with artificial intelligence, like when I was trying to make artwork. So if this thing's just an AI itself, it would make sense that they would be just slightly off.
And I agree with you. And from the next story I'll share will kind of go with what you're talking about with that they're more robotic and or yeah, manufactured some way. Uh, so in 2001, I'm kind of skipping over and back and forth, but this kind of goes with the same topic. 2001, uh, I was no, was it 2001? Yeah, 2001. Um, as I was one of my experiences, what I is I came across another craft and I was trying to hide. I'm trying to run away from it. And as I'm running away, the being was behind me and he was shooting red lasers at me, but purposely missing me because he could have easily hit me. But he hit the ground in front of me to my left, and I saw a red light, like the laser, and then a puff of smoke. And then he kept on shooting this laser back. And when I looked back, that laser wasn't coming from a hand. It was from his belt. And he was wearing a silver suit, and this belt had that where the laser was coming out of. Um, and that was the first time I saw those grays wearing an outfit. Um, and so he was chasing me, and I was trying to hide under the table. I don't know why I always felt I was going to be safe hiding under tables, but I was under this picnic table thing, and while I was under the gray grabbed my arm, and when he grabbed my arm, I was kind of stuck now underneath this table from the way he grabbed me, and his face was right in my face, like 2 inches away from my face. And total gray face, the typical gray with the big protruding eyes. Now, when I pushed his face away from mine, it felt like silly putty, the skin or the mask that this was wearing. And my fingers went through those eye sockets. Those were holograms. My fingers went through the eye sockets and I could feel the mask underneath it. And I pushed it away and then I woke up and my arm had developed these skin problems, and I had the skin problem all my life. Now I know why. It was from their touch. So I was having all these the doctor misinterpreted as being ringworm because it looked like that. They were round, but there were burns, little burns. So now I understand that their touch is what caused my torso to have these marks all my life. My arms, upper arms, and my lower leg, and my upper legs, my inner thighs. It's like I had these marks all my life, and I realized now it's from their fingertips, their touch. But the interesting part is that mask. That is a mask that they're wearing. And
That's actually interesting because recently I came across something and it's weirder than saying aliens or whatever, but they were trying to relate this all to that it's not actually anything that's extraterrestrial. It's actually us, like people doing all these experiments, and we're using the whole alien mask as a means to throw off what we're actually doing. They want to blame it on aliens when it's actually humans doing all the weird stuff, which I don't know if I buy into that or not, but since you brought up a mask, it just kind of made me think about what I just seen like not that long ago.
you know, I think when it came to this experience, what really resonated with me was when I watched one of the Phil Schneider's interviews. And he talks about the underground aliens. I don't know if you've heard that or seen it on YouTube, but Phil Schneider worked for the government and he was called out and talked about this underground war that's happening with um, the Greys that live underground and
Hmm.
Green Berets, Black Berets, and that how he came down and the so-called elevators bring him down to that ground level, and that he saw the same thing I did with the Greys wearing these silver suits and lasers coming out of this belt, which is how his hand was melted, and it shot him in the stomach as well. And and I'm like, oh my God, he's talking about the silver suit and this red laser coming out of the belt. It's exactly what I experienced and saw. So it's interesting. Like when it comes to extraterrestrial, interdimensional, underground. I think once you've experienced one or the other, like that woman told me on the street, was that I was attracting all um, these different species and from different realms. Like I have memories of going through wormholes and getting dizzy from that or falling off my bed. Maybe I wasn't even on my bed because when I fell onto the ground of my bed, I was like feet away. I couldn't have fell off the bed and landed way over there. So interesting that uh, those different experiences I had, um, if that just opened me up to more.
I think like once someone experiences something, that does open them up more to other things, other energy, like energies, entities, whatever you want to call them,
Mhm.
because I don't want to say you're marked or touched or anything like what that lady had said, but I do believe it makes you more susceptible to it because even when people talk about when they have experiences with just say like a cryptid or a ghost or anything like that, I feel like when you start to actually talk with these people, you don't think about it until actually you hear everything. But like if someone says, "Oh, I saw Bigfoot," well, then you start talking to them a little bit later. They also have seen UFOs. And then
Mhm.
there's other like there's more to it. Like there's always a little bit more, and like the more you get into it, I feel like it's somehow all connected some way or the other. And people see a lot of weird things. People have a lot of strange experiences, and it almost runs parallel with each other. Like if you've seen this, then someone's seen that. Like it all somewhat seems connected one way or the other. I don't know how else to explain it, but like I feel like a lot of the stuff is connected.
I agree with you. I really do. Um, as I mentioned, my family, we've had a lot, like not all of my family members, and if they are, they're just in denial of it. But there are a lot of my family that have recollections of these experiences. And in fact, my uncle also, we have a cabin, a trap line near Wabasca, and he stayed there often. And he woke up to the sound of something he's never heard before. And he went and explored it. He found Bigfoot tracks. There was fur on branches. A lot of smaller trees were like crushed down as he was probably running through the bush back there. And that was kind of brought up to the public, and we didn't really want that out there. But yeah, it's he has, and they always say, well, how come there's always only one picture of one foot track? I said, well, that's because the other foot track is like way over here. You can't get them in the same picture. So yeah, I agree. I agree. So in saying that, like, yes, we've encountered spirits, we've encountered little people. There's a lot of different things that I think, like you said, we just start to open up to everything else.
Hmm. That seems to be common. And I used to be very skeptical when people say, "Oh, I had this experience, this experience." I'm like, there's no way you had all these experiences. And it almost, the more I've been doing this, the more I've researched into things, like it is actually really common. Like I'm a lot more open-minded these days than whatever I used to be.
Mhm.
And I just believe now that one way or the other, like it's somehow all connected one way.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And there's a lot of people who've never experienced anything at all.
Hmm.
And they look at you like you must be crazy or delusional, or maybe you need medication. Uh, so, and it's interesting now though, like as opposed to 1999 to 2001 when I was really deep into the research then, um, so many people are now more open-minded about this topic now, especially now with cell phones and easily accessible videos and cameras, and people actually look up and actually might capture something. Um, and every time I seem to talk about this topic, there might be a UFO sighting tonight in Edmonton. We'll see. So I really believe that we're all connected as well. I do believe that what sets off those when I go into a store and I set off those alarms going into the store, that It's my implant that's being picked up on. Um, yeah, because I know I have a scar on my scalp. Um, I always believe that my heart might have had an implant from the pains and the vibrations I would feel when they would show up. And then I have something in my right ankle as well. So there's, I, I think a lot of us who talked about being marked, um, I think they do mark us and they track us, and maybe they're no longer abducting me like they did before because I was told I'm too old for what they used me for. Um, but it's into that I have three sons, and I always told my sons, if you ever have this experience, or tell me if you've had strange dreams. And thankfully they haven't since the one thing that happened in 2001. Um, but I think when it comes to that, I'm always fearful that it's going to continue on these experiences that my sons and then my grandchildren. Um, I talked to one elder and he told me, because my son was going through some hard times. And he said, that's because he's trying to cope with this life. He's a star man trying to adjust to this life. And I thought, okay. And I said, well, I'm grateful that I have sons because I don't want this to happen to them. He said, well, your sons can have daughters. And then that really put things into perspective to me because I know what I was used for. I believe what they're doing to me when I was 8 years old and when I was on that table. I believe that they're prepping me and my body to be working with them for the hybrid program. And maybe I'll talk about that part now, unless you have a question before I start that one.
The only thing I was thinking of to ask a question about is, do you happen to know what type of blood you are?
So I it's strange. I actually asked one time if our bloods can change. So I am RH positive. Is it R positive? Yeah.
So is that the type O negative?
Yes, O positive, but the usual abductee is an O negative.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering because it
Hmm.
seems to be type O negative is the most common
Yes.
coincidence or whatever, but like that is the most common when you talk with people with abductions or whatever, they're usually type O negative,
Yeah,
which
right.
is, I believe that's actually one of the rarest of blood types. So it's interesting that the rarest blood type is what is the most common amongst abductees, but that's also the blood type that they can use universally with anyone else. So I wonder if that's part of it too.
That's right. I did a lot of research on that as well because I was curious. Because I do believe it's, and that's why I thought, can the blood type change? So it sounds silly, but I recall like younger telling me that I was O negative, and then when I went and got some blood work done, I asked, "What is my blood type?" Can you tell me? It said O positive. Oh, and I was curious, did that change or did my mind somehow switch that? Um, but yeah, it is something that I questioned as well. I did want to get my son's blood type checked. Um, and yeah, because their father, I'll just share this really quickly. Their father is originally he's a descendant of Louis Riel, who was a big revolutionary Métis person back in the 1800s. And so my children's father is a descendant of that man. And my ex, he has four brothers, and one of those brothers was abducted back in early, um, what was it? It would have been early 70s, mid 70s. Um, and he was missing for 5 days. And he went missing from a party. He went missing for 5 days. This is up in the mountains. He was found on that fifth day, naked on the side of the road, and a truck driver picked him up. And he said, "What are you doing up here?" Because the Salmo Crested Mountain, it's quite high in the mountains, and he was up there by himself, and he kept on just saying, "They didn't like me. I pissed them off." Sorry, I shouldn't have said. He said, "I got them angry, and they threw me out of the UFO, and I fell through the trees." And he had branches of like marks of him falling through the trees probably. But he was like so out of it, he didn't know what his name was. And He was driven like to Vancouver, which is past, he would have passed his hometown to get to Vancouver, but he was so out of it. And then that truck driver took him to a hospital. Then he was admitted, given shock treatment, everything. Um, and they didn't believe his story that he was taken by aliens. So it was interesting that my children's father didn't believe any of the stuff that I've been through because uh, his own brother went through this. And so anyway, it's so I'm thinking, well, it's interesting that we'd find each other, knowing that he has a brother who's had these experiences, actually was missing for 5 days. It was very similar to Travis Walton's story.
Kind of what I
Um,
was just thinking.
mhm,
It sounds like Travis Walton's story.
mhm,
Um, I've noticed maybe it's a man thing, but I feel like most men are more skeptical.
mhm.
Maybe it's just because that's just how we are just programmed to be men, I guess, these days. I don't know, but like when you look into a lot of these things, like typically when women have experiences or something like that, like even just say paranormal, a lot of the time the men don't believe in it. They're like, oh, there's nothing going on here. My house isn't haunted. Like they try like write everything off, like explain it all. And to be 100% honest, I've done the same thing with some of the weird stuff that's happened to me. I've always tried to rationalize it and write it off and won't accept that it could be what it actually I think it is. Like, no, it has to make sense. I wonder if that's by design. Like
Mm.
we're unknowingly programmed to ignore the things that we see. I know it sounds strange to say it that way, but like I wonder if that's not intentional.
Well, I often wondered um, if it's because they turn it off. And the why I say that is because a lot of my experience, so I was with my children's father since I was 16 years old. So um, from 16 till 35. And during that time, I've had these experiences. And I would say, um, they took me again. How come we didn't wake up? Or he'd say, what? And he'd say, well, nothing happened. I said, yes, it did. This happened. And he didn't believe me. And then he would say, well, how come I didn't wake up? I said, right, exactly. How come you didn't wake up? How come you didn't notice me missing or whatever? Right. And it didn't help that he worked out of town a lot too. So, um, he wasn't always there to be there. And some of my experiences that were very profound happened while he was away and I was home alone. And because I had in 2001, no, sorry, 1991 it was. I had experiences with what I called ancients. I don't know their names or which um entity type it was, but I in my brain, in my mind, my heart, I was calling them ancients, and these ancients showed up in my bedroom, and I had just laid down. I was wide awake, just lay down, and I heard some noise, and I looked, and there was this little petite woman, maybe about 4'5", just very petite. She had very white skin but black hair. Her body looked really frail, and that's maybe why I was calling her ancient because she looked very old, but not her complexion. And and then just as she appeared, there was two other men that showed up on each side of my bed, and my body floated off the bed. They guided my this happening. Each of them grabbed an arm, and then they stood me up at the foot of my bed, but I wasn't touching the ground, my floor. And then they moved me and they held me. It's like I was floating, and they moved me into the living room of my home, and they just moved their hand and like shifted their hand, like say from left to right. And as they did that, the room, my living room shifted, it twisted, turned, and now I was in a UFO. At that moment, though, I didn't know I was in a UFO. I was like, wow, this is a cool room. why is it round? And there was no loose furniture around. It was like kind of like Star Trek. They're all like built-in seating. Um, and they're still holding on to me. And they pointed to the one of the windows because it was all windows all around. They pointed to the window, and then we were just at the window. Like I didn't feel us moving. We were just there. And they pointed down, and I was hovering above a busy intersection of the city of Edmonton, but the opposite side of the city. And it was like I was 76th Ave and 92nd Street. I always remember that address. And I've driven by it a few times thinking this is interesting because at the moment I thought this is a cool room. Why is it above the intersection? Uh, uh, so that was a very to me that was very traumatic still, even though I knew they weren't there to show me harm. They were trying to show me something and communicate with me, but unfortunately I was still young. I still didn't understand. I didn't want any of this. I was always wondering like why me? Why am I? And these people are different. They look like humans, natives, and the others were grays and or they were tall with robes, or they were panthers, or they're men in blacks, or so these were different, and they only appeared to me once that I recall.
I haven't heard the pan. Someone recently reached out to me and told me I needed to reach out to someone else because they had saw, and I forget what they called it, but I believe it was like a I want to say it was like a cat person, but they called it something. They gave it a name, and
Mm,
it was a black panthery looking humanoid.
mm.
It
They're
was a couple months ago. They'd messaged me over on Facebook, and I need to go back and look into that now. But when you said the panthers were they humanoidish or were they actually just like normal looking panthers?
you know, they stood up on two legs, their hind legs, and had a gate, and they opened the gate. Um, so I would have to say that that's why I wasn't sure if they were a shapeshifter.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because for them to change from the panther, uh, and then they tried to come into my home by pretending they were somebody else, a human that I know and a relative. And I said, I'm not letting you in. I know what you are. I know who you are. And then they turned back into that panther. Um, so some people, so I was reading on something here and somebody was talking about phantom cats or alien big cats. So there have been other people who have seen these, and including my relative, as I mentioned, her and her children still see grays and these panther-like beings.
Yeah, there's definitely got to be some correlation with that then, because if you'd seen it and your family's seeing it, I don't know like I said, this is kind of new to me for hearing anything related to like a feline looking cat type thing. So I'm gonna have to go back and try and find that person that I was told to reach out to and try and research it here a little bit better.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to hear what they have to say, just because of what we've experiencing. And to me, those were they were threatening. They were they were not there to help us. They were very threatening, and what they threatened me to take my children from me if I didn't stop my project. And my cousin, what she deals with right now, or her kids are seeing this as well. And um, yeah, and so they come to me when they something new has happened because they know I've been researching this for a long time. My cousin had a recent experience with a gray. That same thing, it touched her feet, and when it did that, but she went into like she explains it that she went into like uh convulsions, like she was shaking, she couldn't stop seizing or whatever it was that they were doing to her. And then she was screaming, and her daughter came to the bedroom, and when her daughter appeared, the gray disappeared. So she was called me. She was traumatized. Like she didn't have to tell you what happened. So we had long talks about what she's been through and the connection I've made with our family who've had these experiences are those who've lived on that property at my grandmother's home. Um, so this relative, she lived at that property. She grew up there. I lived there for a couple of years. Another cousin lived there. I have another, actually, I'll share this memory. I'm kind of bouncing around on this one, but I remember living at during the time where it was before our UFO experience. And we had a chicken coop that was next to our home, and my grandmother was in there collecting eggs, and my uncle, who must have been about 16 at the time, walked by and he started sneezing and he started screaming. And I can see it looked at him and there was blood coming out of his nose. And he was screaming and saying, "There's something up there, there's something up there." And he reached into his nostril and he pulled out this, it looked like a little ball that had little holes inside. Like you can see through it if you moved it around. It was really neat. It looked real interesting. And it had a bit of a hook on it. So I think the hook is what was lodged back into his nostril. And but he sneezed it out. And I remember saying, "Oh, what is that?" And he said, "I don't know. It came out of my nose." And, you know, so I remember like things like that, like as a child, like these little things, right? And it wasn't until I started researching this topic and really coming into terms with what I've been through, and then putting all the pieces together. I still have a lot of missing pieces, but I have enough pieces to like at least um kind of make sense of some of the story of my life and um I always wanted to do the regression so I could fill in the rest of the puzzle. Um but I've been told by elders and people who've been researching and saying, you know what, you know enough. If you go into that rabbit hole, you might not come out. And at 52 years old right now, um I've come to terms with my experiences were, and I think because I'm still here, number one, I'm still here. They obviously didn't want to kill me because they could have done that when I was 7 years old. Um, but I know they used me for a purpose, and that's what I thought I would go into that part of this. If I'm not even sure how much time we have, that's something I need to ask you as well.
Well, you're good. You can go ahead and go into it.
Okay. Um, so as a preteen, so like 11 years old, I started having a lot of these experiences or sorry, changes in my body. Of course, we're going through puberty, but I was having a lot of strange things. Not only was I mentioned I had a lot of these marks on my body that looked like what I realize now were fingertips because it'd be three or four in a row. And now it made sense, that there could be fingertips from them holding me down. Um, because one of the memories or one of the things that I encountered was a lot of movement in my stomach. I used to be pretty athletic in high school, preteens, and the doctor said, "Oh, there must be just stomach spasms." He'd never test me. Um, but so I was having these strange feelings. Um, as I was going through puberty, um, I was having what they would call irregular menstrual cycle. I would have nothing for 3 months and then boom, I would have them again. And it was a lot of that missing uh, time. So I just grew to think that, okay, I must just have a regular cycle. Uh, but I would have strange things like I would wake up and my belly button area would be really um, tender. And I was always wondering, like, why is my belly button always sore? And why am I finding black tar in my belly button? Like it's a jelly texture. What is this in my belly button? Why did it get there? Um, and then the movements in my stomach. And the other thing that was strange, and of course, in health back in the day, they never got into depth of what our bodies go through, whether it's puberty or pregnancy. But I was lactating, which I thought was normal. I didn't realize that it wasn't normal. Um, So I went through from the age 11 till about 22 with the same thing. I'd go through these different cycles of no menstrual and mo stomach movements and this black tar in my belly and my belly button and these marks on my body. Um, and one time I was probably about 15. And while I was laying in bed, I actually felt a full movement in my stomach, as if something just turned over. And I got scared and I thought, well, what's going on? That's when I went to the doctor and they said, oh, it must be stomach spasms. He didn't even bother checking me for pregnancy because I was only a certain age and obviously not um, be in a situation to get pregnant. So they never checked me. I never thought to even check. Um, it wasn't until So as I mentioned, I was with my spouse since I was 16. We talked about starting a family when I was 18, and still I was very young. I know that, but we couldn't get pregnant. We went through testing. Um, Nothing seemed to be wrong, but we just couldn't have a child. And in 1994, I went and sat with an elder in BC, different province, and uh, she she was weaving a dream catcher earrings. At the time, I didn't know much about my culture, so I asked her, "What are you making?" She said, "They're dream catcher earrings," and she said, "The bad dreams go through the and get lost in the web, and the good dreams go through the diamond." And I said, wow. I said, I really need something like that. I said, I've been having really weird dreams all my life. And I used to call them, I told her I call them wake dreams because I wake up from a dream when I'm already awake. And I said, a lot of bad things happen in those dreams. And then she prayed over me. And then she said, take these earrings and wear them. And when you wear them, you pray and you ask for a child. I'm like, oh, okay. So I went home really back to the hotel real happily with my ex at the time worked for CN Rail. And so I was traveling with him through BC. Everything was in storage at home and I'm traveling with him. So I went back to the hotel and I said, guess what? I got these earrings from this lady. She told me to dream about a baby and ask for it. And he just thought, yeah, okay, because we've been trying for so long, he just kind of gave up on it. So that evening, that night is when I call when I'm writing my story, my book, this is what I call the chapter would be meeting the children. So I woke up again from being awake. I was awake and I woke up again and I'm now walking in this hazy, misty blue gray room and I was on a craft. It was I couldn't see very far around me because there was not much light. It was just this misty, and the room was illuminated a little bit with this grayish blue color. And there was kind of a moisture in the air, kind of like a mist, similar to when you go to the produce section and they got the mist coming. It was something like that, just a lot more finer. Like it wasn't leaving like moisture on me. But I was being led by what I would call a woman figure and she was leading me into this room. There was also two rows of children. And if I was to like just guess off the top of my head, there's maybe 20 or more children. And some of them were really young and some of them were old. So if I look at how many years of experiences I've had since 11 years old, yeah, they might be 10 years old. So as I'm walking between these two rows of children, some of them had heads of the size of grays. Some had normal heads. Some had hair. Some didn't have hair. Some had big eyes. Some had normal human eyes. So they were all different. But I felt so much love for these children. Even though they looked different, I wasn't even alarmed at how different they looked. And the little ones, the young ones, were walking beside me and grabbing at my shirts or grabbing my hands. And I just remember looking at all these children and just feeling like, wow, I just felt so much love. And then that woman turned around with the baby and she handed it to me and she said, you can keep this one. And I woke up from that. I woke up crying because I missed those children and I missed what I had just experienced. And I told my ex that I had a dream that we were given a baby boy. She said, well, we can keep this one. And he just looked at me because we've been trying for years. And he said, yeah, maybe you caught a dream because I was wearing those earrings. And I said, oh, wasn't that cool? Well, from that town, we're going to a different town through BC. I started having those heart pains again. And the back of my neck feeling. And I was like, something's going to happen. Something's going to happen again. Oh my God, I hate this. And yeah, so I had the heart pains for 3 days, which normally doesn't last that long. I went to the hospital in Burns Lake because that's where we ended up, Burns Lake, BC. And every time he came into the room, the heart pains went away. Every time he walked out of the room, the heart pain started again. I said, why? I said, stay here, stay here. Uh, but, he didn't even check me. Again, we didn't even think about checking for pregnancy because I was coming in there for the heart problem. And so he gave me a prescription for some muscle relaxant and then I'm lined up at the pharmacy and I see pregnancy tests. I thought, I'm going to buy one. So I bought one and it came back, I was pregnant. And it would have been 4 weeks from that date of that dream when I woke up from that dream. And so throughout my son's pregnancy, I knew there was going to be a boy and I knew he'd be born on February 1st. And my doctor would say, no, 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 you're going to be about February 14th to 20th. I said, no, don't go anywhere. He'll be here on February 1st. Throughout the whole pregnancy, that was what I'd tell the doctor. He would roll his eyes at me. He said, I've been doing this for 25 years. No woman's ever predicted the date. I said, well, don't go anywhere. Sure enough, I went into labor on January 31st, and I was in 24 hours of labor, and he was born on February 1st. And the doctor was surprised. He said, how did you know? I said, I don't know, but I told you not to go anywhere. So it was interesting, meeting the children. So that's when I realized what I was used for and why they told me I was now too old that's why they don't need me anymore.
Do you happen to know? I don't well, no one really knows, but like, do they give any idea of what they use them for?
No. But one of the elders that talked to me about it, because he seemed to know a lot about this, he says that we humans or whatever made a contract that we would help the Greys to repopulate their earth, and so they're mixing. So what they were doing is, what I realized is that they were injecting the fetus or the egg into me. I was like an incubator, and then they'd come back after 3 months and take the fetus from me, and then have them grow wherever, if it was on this ship or if there's somewhere else. But what I believe or what I feel, it was to repopulate. Something about them not being able to reproduce on their own, and they needed us.
Trying to think, like, I've had other people that have talked about it too, where they've met what would be basically their children, their clone children. And it's strange to me that if these things are here to help, the way they go about doing things is they don't have the capacity for caring like we do.
Mhm.
I'm not saying they're here with negative intentions or anything like that, but they don't have the compassion, the human element of emotion. I don't think that's like they're, I don't want to say lifeless, but they do what they do. They don't get hung up on the emotions like a human would. So for them coming in there and taking something and experimenting with it, we also have to consider what we do to animals.
Right.
We tag animals. We study animals. We watch how they do things. We've messed around with genetics. We've tried to clone sheep. We consider ourselves human and oh, we're good in this and that. But and then these things come down and do the same thing. We're like, oh, they're terrible. They're coming to do this. Well, I mean, to them, they're doing the same thing that we do. They see us doing it to everything else around us. So they're just doing the same thing back to us. It's
Right. And Mhm.
That's all I was going to say.
So because I've been through this, I also would say the same thing. That we're doing the same thing that they're doing, and to that animal who's getting, like, maybe it's, for makeup or whatever that they're using those studying those animals for, they're doing it with no care either, right? It's they've got a mission, and it's to um whatever they're doing with the testing of animals. Uh, and I felt like when I was a kid, I remember saying, um, we're just like ants in an ant farm, and the aliens are the ones who are watching us at this ant farm. And that was the only way I could really explain it as a child, right? As I feel like we're just ants in an ant farm.
It's kind of how I would describe it myself, just because it's the same thing. It's the same concept. Literally, if they're able to travel through space and time and everything else, and they come to our planet, we're just little ants crawling around doing our thing.
Hmm. And that when you talked about like having no compassion and no feeling, I totally felt that with those grays, definitely. I felt that they uh like were more robotic, no soul. They're just operating on whatever is driving them. The only one that I really felt I had compassion or feelings would have been those ancient ones, and that mother figure who led me through the room. I felt like she was the mom to the children. Like that's why I called her the mother figure. Um, and you're right, like, are they being raised? Uh, what's the purpose for them? Um, what does that mean for those children now? Like, um, are they are they still around? Like, I have so many questions, right, as to what happened. Um, so it's been an interesting journey in trying to learn about my experiences and share. I'm very open to sharing. I feel it helps me heal when I can share a bit of the story, because I also believe that there's thousands, if not millions, of people going through these things, and they don't realize that thing was just a bad dream, or why did I wake up with this bruise on me, or they don't realize really that they're maybe being used like I was. Um, Being that my conscious memory remembers all this, but what I don't know is, like, there's probably thousands of experiences that I don't know, or that I had. I don't know if thousands, but um, when you look at from a span of age 7 to 35 is kind of when things stop. And I know they still feel like they still watch me, but they're not doing anything to me. It's from what I understand. But uh, it is something I'd have to say I'm stronger now, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, than I was going through all this. Because it was starting to surface that I was having these natural psychic abilities, I might want to call them, but not really psychic abilities, just a higher intuition. Um, I was having a lot of premonition dreams. I've had those all pretty much all my life. Um, and when it comes to the healing, I got into Reiki in 2004. And I feel like that really helped me. If somebody ever says, how did you overcome what you've been through? I'd have to say it was Reiki. And one of the things had to learn to overcome was the fear. And because I was afraid of everything, I was scared to look up. I was scared. to go somewhere by myself in the dark. There were so many things I was afraid of because I thought there was going to be an alien hiding behind there. But yeah, I went through a lot of fears, and Reiki really helped me. And I learned a lot about energy and how to protect myself and others. So I really feel going through that helped me heal from that and then accept and knowing that it was in the past, it can't hurt you now, and understanding what post-traumatic stress and trauma does to a person and their psyche and their whole being. So I really put credit into Reiki, um, and I became a Reiki master in 2007, and I really have to credit. In fact, I call my Reiki master teacher, I call her my angel on earth, uh, because without her, I probably wouldn't be where I am today in my healing.
I've talked to several people that are into Reiki and everything, and it seems to do wonders for them. So I've often been curious about looking into it for myself, but it's just something that I've never actually dove into too much. But I did have a couple more questions I was wanting to ask before we wrap this up.
Sure.
Your first experience with UFO, you were around 7, I think you said.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with this, and I just kind of stumbled across this here within the last month or two, but it is very common for people to become infatuated with UFOs and aliens or remember abduction scenarios or anything like that. And it's always around the time that they're in second grade. That would be around 7 years old. And if you look into other people that have had these experiences, it is usually around 7 or 8 when they start to have these experiences. And I don't know the correlation to that. It's just, I've noticed it now. It's started to become a very common trend around that age group.
Yeah, I've been researching this topic since 1999. I was heavily involved in a lot of research. We used to meet in Pal Talk. It was a voice chat type of thing at the time. And I did so much research, and out of all the people I spoke to who had similar experiences, it all started from the age of 6 or 7. And I believe at that time, um, as our bodies are growing and developing, and the top of our skull, that closes up at the top, I believe that's when things start to happen. And yes, I think when it comes to that age, I think they're prepping us. They're getting us ready for what they need us for. And then by the time you hit the age of 10 or 11, that's when they start using us for their purpose, impregnating us. And this, I'm speaking for women, and and using us in that way. And it made sense now, like as I got older and put the pieces together, because it wasn't until 1999 that I really accepted these experiences and really tried to learn and understand what was really happening to me. Because I knew they weren't just dreams. I knew they weren't because I woke up having ailments or marks on my body or like I said, the fingerprint marks all over my body. Um, it was something that I didn't want to accept because I knew that it wasn't going to be something that was going to be accepted. And like people would say, my ex, for example, made a comment and he'll laugh if he listens to this interview because I remember saying, like, um, I really like something's happening. I really need help. There's something going on. I need to go to the hospital. There's something wrong. And he'd say, yeah, I'll take you to the mental hospital and drop you off there. So it was hard to be with somebody who didn't want to know or didn't want to believe that this was happening. It's interesting now. We've been separated for a long time now, but he's into all those UFO shows now. So
After the fact.
yeah.
No, it's the other thing I was going to ask is you said you had what you think is implants. Have you ever had them actually looked at and ever thought about having them removed?
Well, Daryl Sims is actually a really good friend of mine. Um, And
He
we've
was just
talked
on an
about,
episode recently.
yeah, I know. It's,
Mhm.
it's wonderful. I met him, I think, oh gosh, 2005 or six. Oh no, it was before that. Yeah. So I met him a long time ago, and he was in one of our Pal Talk um, chats, and that's how I met him. And he was talking about like we can get an implant that's do the black light on you. And I'm like, well, I don't think they're doing anything to me now. But I would like to know about the implants now. Uh, Interestingly enough, I mentioned messengers that come into my life. Um, I went and saw a healer once for something else. I didn't tell her anything about my UFO life, nothing. I went in there I was having like hives, breakout in hives, and while she was doing this theta healing, um, she looked at me very strangely and then said to me, "You have a lot of missing memory. I don't mean you're forgetting, but you have a lot of memories that were taken from you. Do you know what I'm talking about?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "And did you know that they used you? They just treated you like you were just a piece of meat and they didn't have any care in how they handled you, but they used you for years." And I said, "Yes, I'm aware." And then she went on, she was still doing her theta healing. I don't know if you've been to a theta healer, but they kind of use their fingers and they scan your body. They run from top to bottom and they like just like they might be like 5 feet away and she's doing the scanning. And then she said, "Do you know what they used you for?" I said, "Yes." And then she said, "You tried to have children? Did you try?" I said, "Yes, we tried to have children for a long time." She said, "Do you know why you did not have children when you were trying?" And she said, "Because they disconnected your the way she was trying to explain it in simple terms was they disconnected your uterus to your vagina so you could not get pregnant because they needed your uterus." And I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. And then she went on to say, "Do you know that they're still tracking you?" And I said, "Well, I kind of have a feeling they're still tracking me, but they haven't bothered me that I'm aware of." She said, "No, they're still watching over you." But she said, "You have 3 implants in your body. 2 of them are deactivated and one is still activated." And she went to the same thing that I said, that the side of my skull, that there's one in there. I can actually feel it. And there's one underneath my ear. I can feel that in there. And then one in my heart, and then one at that ankle, the same one that I was mentioning. I was like, everywhere that she said they were, that's where I thought they were. Um, so she was very upset. She was getting emotional while she was doing this healing on me. And I didn't understand where that came from because I had already come to terms with what had happened to me. Now, of course, not knowing everything that happened to me. She was very aware of what I'd been through. And so I find it unique that I've had a lot of these messengers fill in some of the blanks of my questions that I had, and she was one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting that she was able to pinpoint a lot of things and had information just by being not really knowing your backstory or anything.
Yeah, she
So,
knew nothing about me at all. I just went and seen her because she came to the community where I was living in, and I wanted to see what the theta healing was going to do with these breakouts that I was having because I felt like it was something happening at work, an environmental thing. And then all of a sudden, the whole healing session turned into uh, learning more about my UFO experiences and what was done to me.
yeah, it's I always find these experiences people have interesting. It's not anything I would ever say I want to experience, but at the same time, it's kind of like my curiosity is peaked to the point to where I need an answer. You know what I mean? I don't want to experience it, but it's almost like you have to experience it in order to actually understand it. And I don't think anyone can really relate to it unless they actually go through it themselves. And
And yeah, you're right.
it's hard. Like I said, when people listen to stuff like this and your ex is this very stereotypical average person. Like when someone talks about this, they're like, need to take you to the loony bin or whatever, put your tinfoil hat on, which is why I call the show what I call it, because it's kind of like to the average person, the people that experience all this stuff, we're ridiculed. We're not taken seriously. We're called crazy, or no one understands the struggle of what it actually is. What if they ever consider that everything that someone says is actually true? But no one thinks that way.
Right.
It's easier just to write it off and poke fun at people rather than accept the fact that, you know what, maybe this is real.
Right. And exactly. It is one of those topics that is not easy to bring up at um, a dinner or with a group of people unless they're in that same type of research. Um, and the reaction of what people have. And I'll share a quick story from when I was 8 years old. I remember in grade three now, we were supposed to write, in English, we're supposed to write, what was your most memorable experience? And I was excited. I was going to write about my UFO experience. Of course, at 8 years old, I would have had a lot more details because I would have remembered it more clearly as it just happened a year before. And I wrote about my UFO experience. And I remember getting a big F on that on my paper. And everybody else was up, could go up and talk about what their story was about. One was talking about the pony they got for their birthday. Another one talked about their trip to Disneyland. And but I wasn't asked to talk about my story. And so at the end, she called me to her desk and I was crying because I was 8 years old and I was like, but, and then she said, I want to talk to you about that. You're supposed to write about something true. And, but you can be a great fictional writer one day. You had so many details. And I said, but that was true. And I said, it happened. It happened. And it was in the paper. And my brother almost died that night. And she said, and then so she kind of looked at me and was like trying to feel sorry for me, that look of awe. And she said, okay, well, if they're here, why are they here? And out of the mouth that what came out of my mouth was interesting because it was like, these are words we didn't learn in grade three. She said, well, why are they here then? And I said, they are here for our natural resources. Wabasca is abundant with natural resources. Now, this was 1980 when that happened. The exploration for oil and gas in Wabasca did not happen until 1990, 1991. And at that time, it was a native community, one way in, one way out. Not a reserve, it was a native community, but there was a reserve that surrounded the community. And so in 1990, the exploration was, yes, Wabasca is abundant with natural resources. It's in the backyard, basically, of the Fort McMurray, which is the biggest oil and gas, I think, in Canada. But so Wabasca is like an extension of that. And so for being 8 years old and knowing about the natural resources and the word abundant, we didn't know that in grade three. Um, yeah, so I wish I could have had a copy of that story. You know, there's a lot of things I wish I would have kept, you know, when we look back now, um, of these experiences and the time frames and yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things to where, as a child, you remember so much stuff that I remember, again, same age frame, but I was around 7 or 8 when a lot of the weird stuff that I remember was kind of happening. And it wasn't like, to my knowledge, UFO or anything really like that, but like a lot of the weird stuff that happened was right around the time I was about 8 years old.
Mm.
And I've just always found it interesting now within the last few weeks when I've heard that this is about that age time frame of when people start experiencing a lot of weird stuff. So again, does it all connected? It kind of leads me back to what I was saying earlier. Like I feel like all of this stuff, one way or the other, is somehow connected. But
Yeah, and I agree. And one of the things that I try to share with people is when your child comes to you and says you've had this experience or a dream, pay attention to that. Pay attention to what they're saying because nobody took a interest into what I was going through, except my grandmother. Like I said, she had a lot of experiences too. Um, and I often wonder was how do they choose the families? Like what was it that my grandmother's side of the family, what was it that was an interest to them? And
Hmm.
why some of our cousins and not everybody? Um, and again, it's one of those questions. It's how do they pick and choose the people they take and use? And I also know a lot of people in the area. It's like actually what I mentioned to Daryl Sims was that they should, I was actually going to do one, but I because of what happened in 2001, I chose that I'll let somebody else tell my story because what I went through was very challenging when I was trying to work on that documentary, that story there. But, I always say, listen to the children, listen to what they're saying, and because that's where we have to be as parents to support that and at least try to understand it. So I'm always asking my sons, like, if you've ever had experiences, tell me, any bad dreams, tell me. And none of them ever came forward with anything. But
Well,
yeah.
that's good at least that if they don't remember or if nothing's happening, then they're not at least dealing with it.
Yeah, I
So,
think in our family it was mostly the women. Well, except for my uncle who had that up his nose, that implant up his nose. Um, yeah. I know a couple men that around the same time I grew up, Slave Lake, Lesser Slave Lake, if you ever look on the map, Lesser Slave Lake is the biggest lake in Alberta. And a lot of activity happened in that lake. So I did a lot of research back in my area. And Wabasca Slave Lake, a hotbed. I was told that it also was a negative vortex that goes through Wabasca. So it makes a lot of sense of the activity that happens up there, not just UFO. But there's a lot of activity around the lake, and a lot of people who witness these UFOs, they say the same thing. They're hovering above the lake. They're either sucking up water, they're doing something with the water. Um, and I know two men that have a story that was in our Edmonton Journal, which is like the city of Edmonton's big newspaper. In 1997, these two gentlemen had an experience where they were driving on the highway, and the next thing they know was that there was a light shining through the windshield, and they were now um, being carried up into the sky, and they ended up going into a craft. And actually, if I find the newspaper clipping, I'll share it with you. Uh, and he explained to me what he saw, what they did to his cousin. He talked about how when they're talking about harvesting, they like gold for some reason. Um, and so he talked about this craft that they took him out of the car. The car was inside the craft. They took out his cousin and he put him on this, he said this looked like a crucifix that came up from the floor. And they put his friend, his cousin up against that crucifix, and it closed him off like around his arms, like it held him down. And these things came out of the cross, and they were like going into his face, into his mouth, and to his nose. Um, and he was trying to fight off the other aliens that were coming around him. And he said, I kicked them between the legs and nothing happened. And but he never shares what happened with him. He told me what they did to his friend. And what I believe that they were using men for was extracting sperm.
that is a possibility. And I don't know how to, again, like I said, without going through something like that and relating to it, it's hard to
Mhm.
say anything to that because it's just like it's one of those things. Like I said, I don't want to experience it myself, but at the same time, it's like unless you experience it, you can't relate. And I've said that about a lot of things. So, but,
Well, before I sign off, I wanted to say, like in 2001, when I was working on that project, and I was screaming to the ceiling and saying, it ends with me, it stops with me, take my life, I'll sacrifice my life for my children. I said all those things, and then everything stopped. Everything did stop. And my son then said, Mommy, they're 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 not going to bother us anymore. No more bad things are going to happen to us. And he had a visitor and told him that he was there to protect us. And he described this visitor as being all like he was illuminating a white light. He was dressed in a white robe. He had a long beard. And he told him that no more bad things are going to happen and he was going to watch over us. And, he was 3.5 and he's now 26 years old. And I believe when he said that, that was true because nothing bad, in quotations, has happened to me or us since then.
Mm-hmm. I will, there's something we can talk about it here off air, but I want to wrap this up here and just one more thing. If you would like for anyone in the listening audience to reach out to you, where would be a good way for them to contact you?
Yeah, well, I typically use Facebook. That's probably my main um social media platform that I use. I was going to start doing some stories in TikTok or Instagram, but I'm not really too familiar with using those platforms. So Facebook would be the place, and I would be very happy if someone wants to add me. I appreciate people who want to learn more, or maybe they have a story they want to share with me. I've I'm very open to that. So my name to find me on Facebook is Allison, Allison, and my last name is an Indigenous last name. It is Yellowknee, Yellowknee, and you can add me, and I can certainly accept that.
Awesome. Well, Allison, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I definitely appreciate you coming on here tonight and talking with me.
Thank you, Brandon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thank you so much.
Yep. Well, for anyone listening, I want to say thanks to everyone out there. And again, thanks to Allison. And we'll check you on the next one. So good night, everybody. And that's the show, everyone. I really hope you guys enjoyed the conversations. If you would like to be a guest on Tinfoil Tales, remember to send an email to tinfoiltalespodcast@gmail.com or go to the contact section of tinfoiltales.com. Just get your message to me. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. And just remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.
Tinfoil Tales in the headphones. Yeah, it's time to rock. Got a story about a cryptid creature, let's take a walk. Bigfoot, dogman, they're out there in the dark. But the truth is out there like an alien spark. UFO sightings got the whole world shook. Conspiracies unfold like a story in a book. Media control, trying to keep us blind. But oh, before gonna use my whole mind. In history, they don't want us to know the secrets they're hiding, the truth they won't show. Domain of society, they keep us in chains. Burns them in talk, it's time to break the reins. Control, trying to keep us blind. But I won't be fooled, gonna use my own mind. In history, they don't want us to know